We're starting what is for me one of my absolute favorite events of the year, and this is the So Kwan Luk Lectureship. And I'm especially honored to be the sort of master of ceremonies here tonight because I have the immense good fortune to be the So Kwan Luk Professor at the Graduate School of Global Policy and Strategy. And this naming similarity reflects a very important historical reality in our school, which is that as we've built China studies at the University of California, San Diego, one of our earliest, strongest, best, most consistent, and most generous supporters has been Mr. So Kwan Luk, Kwan So, as we all call him. And from the beginning of Kwan's support for the China program, based on a really broad, far-seeing vision that these two great countries, China and the United States, have so much in common, but also inevitably areas of friction. I think that was a vision that we now see realized in many ways today, both good and bad. Obviously, it's going to be the part of our discussion with Tsai tonight. But Kwan foresaw many of these issues, many of these problems, and of course many of the opportunities. And so it was precisely for this purpose that Kwan from the beginning said, in addition to the other kinds of support, I'd also like to create a lectureship. It was his idea, it was his concept. And the very first occupant, the very first person who came to deliver the So Kwan Luk lectureship was the Dean of Studies of China and China Overseas, Mr. Wang Gongwu, Professor Wang Gongwu in Singapore, who a very distinguished gentleman, and I believe was hosted at the So's house when he came here. I just saw Professor Wang in Singapore. He's 88 years old, just published a new book, still lightning quick, one of the sharpest minds I've ever met. And he shook my hand, and of course the first thing he said was, "And how's Kwan So and Marion So doing?" It was a delightful moment. So it's really a pleasure to bring this now to almost our 20th iteration. And in order to introduce the participants, first I'm going to ask Dean Peter Cowie to come forward and say a few words of welcome on behalf of the university and the School of Global Policy and Strategy. Peter.
So thanks very much, Barry. I am a poor but larger substitute for Chancellor Khosla, who was supposed to be with us tonight. Chancellor Khosla was flying back from Europe, and guess what happened? His plane flights got messed up. So he asked me to send his personal apologies. But on behalf of the Chancellor and for all of us at the School of Global Policy and Strategy and the larger UC San Diego community that has a passion for China and is engaged with the 21st Century China program, I welcome you here. UC San Diego is truly a global university. It draws the highest caliber of scholars and students from around the world. But within that global reach, the relationship with China obviously looms very, very large. Our activities as a school and as a university are intended to serve all of human society, but in particular, we attempt to use our insights from research and teaching to build partnerships. And certainly this relationship between the United States and China is one of the key partnerships that will define the evolution of the 21st century and the fate of human society on this planet. So as we undertake this effort in partnership, it's important that we invest and nurture the institutions that can be the catalyst for the partnership. And I think that both Chancellor Khosla and I would like to pay special tribute to the leadership of the 21st Century China Center. I could go through all the names, but obviously two are particularly important from the ranks of our scholars, Professor Susan Shirk and Professor Barry Naughton. School of Global Policy and Strategy itself is very much part and parcel of this vision of partnership. It's also part of the DNA of UC San Diego to do the unconventional. When this school was created 30 years ago, and as we celebrate its 30th anniversary, we made a bet. And we made a bet that the focus of global dynamics would shift from a fulcrum point in the Atlantic to one in the Pacific, where Asia and the Americas would be the start of the great events in the world. And I think that vision has been proven out and that we have built appropriately for it. As part of that continuous effort to build partnership, reflection, research, understanding, and service, I'm pleased to say that this August we're convening the inaugural UC San Diego Forum on U.S.-China relations. It's going to be a high-level meeting of thought leaders drawn from all quarters of U.S. Society, business, government, nonprofits, universities, people who are distinguished in their work and understanding of China, and it will also include some influential, and if I might say independent-minded, experts from China in the discussion. We see this as the beginning of an annual event that will be a signature place for the reflection on this partnership in all of its highs and lows. And of course, as Professor Naughton said, none of this would have come to fruition without the foresight, the energy, the unwavering dedication of Quan and Marion So, for both establishing this lectureship and establishing the chair that Barry holds. I want to thank them. I want to thank their daughter Annie and their daughter-in-law Grace, who are with us also tonight. So to the entire So family, take a bow. And finally, I want to say that it's a great honor for us to have Tsai as our featured lecturer tonight. We're fortunate that he and his wife, Clara Wu, have chosen to live here in the UC San Diego neighborhood and to become active participants in our university. So with that said, let me welcome Professor Naughton back to the podium so that he can continue his role as the Master of Ceremonies. And to all of you, thank you for braving the rains. Thank you for showing a passion for this program. And thank you for being our partners in building it to the next level of greatness.
Yeah, San Diegans are not afraid of a little rain, right? We're all out here. Adversity, we can handle it. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce Tsai, who's our featured speaker and conversant of the night. I think everybody knows that Tsai is the executive vice chairman of the Alibaba Corporation and one of the small group of the founders of Alibaba who worked with Jack Ma from day one to create this amazing, amazing company. There's no point in me adding very many details to his biography except to say that he's somebody who it's not as if the Alibaba opportunity dropped out of the sky on him. This is somebody who was preparing, who had already come from Taiwan to the United States, had engaged in the American education system, went to Yale, studied economics and East Asian studies, the two greatest combination of things that you could possibly study in this world. Then went on to study law at Yale Law School. He had a whole career of his own before Alibaba. And this is somebody, a person of principle who follows his own ideals and vision as well. And it's my understanding, of course, this may be mythology, but I suspect this is like many myths, a myth founded in reality, that when Jack Ma was starting up, he said, no, if you want to be with me, you have to leave everything else behind and join our small group at a relatively small, shall we say, initial salary. And Joe didn't hesitate, and he joined this group of people who, let's face it, in some fundamental way, changed the world we live in today. So Joe is going to be joined in conversation by Susan Shirk, Susan is, of course, a professor here at GPS and the head of the 21st Century China program, and also the lead author of a task force report that was just published 2 days ago on how U.S. policy should be adapted to cope with this new situation and the increased tensions between China and the United States. Joe Tsai and Susan Shirk, will you please come on up to the podium?
I've enjoyed some of our recent conversations about U.S.-China relations, and I'm really glad that you agreed to come and honor the Soft family by participating in this great event and to continue the conversation with our friends in the community. So
Susan, first, I'm really honored to be here. I really want to, again, acknowledge Mr. and Mrs. So and their family here. The other people I want to acknowledge are my parents-in-law. They're also sitting here. And I know that in the audience, there are a lot of professors. My father-in-law was an economics professor at the University of Kansas for 30 years. So Dad and Mom, I want to recognize. And we wouldn't be here. My wife is also here, my wife Clara. So Clara and I wouldn't be here if it weren't for my parents-in-law, because almost, I think, something like 16 years ago, they had the wisdom of picking San Diego as their new home to retire. Mm-hmm. And that's why we've decided to come here and start to raise a family here. So
that's great. Well, thanks to all of you. It is one of the great advantages of UCSD is that we attract a wonderful community around us at every stage in life, right? We have young people coming, and then we have all these interesting, very young retired people who come here too, which is great. We just picked our place to retire a little early, right? So let's start with the title you chose for our conversation, the symbiosis of China and the United States. Now, the meaning of symbiosis is you have two dissimilar organisms, but they're in a mutually beneficial relationship. And so let's just start by asking you to say a little bit about how you see this as a symbiotic relationship and what you think are the most important elements in it, and what are the benefits that the two countries get from it.
Sure. I find it quite interesting that I will have to refresh people's memories on symbiosis between the two countries, because this really happened very quickly, this sort of antagonism or the sense of conflict between China and the United States really happened over the last 18 months. And but the reality is, on several levels, the two countries are quite interdependent. Right. There is the trade aspect. I know there's a lot of trade, but right now the Trump administration is harking about the trade deficit. But the reality is, China is importing something like $180 billion of goods, and also about $60 billion of services from the United States. There's actually a service surplus that the United States enjoys with China to the tune of $40 billion every year. So that's, America is benefiting from that. And I would touch upon that later on, but I think this trade deficit will, over time, structurally correct itself as China imports more, because there is a real critical mass of 300 million consumer middle class that would be buying from the United States. So that's at the trade level, very symbiotic. The other thing is business activity, corporate activity. There are 68,000 American companies operating in China. And annually, they generate about $600 billion of revenue and $40 billion of profits. We've all seen how successful Apple, Starbucks, companies like Nike are making lots of money in China. And of course, when the Chinese economy seem to show a little bit of weakness, Apple catches a huge cold. So that's the interrelationship, and then there's at the financial level, China holds more than $1 trillion of American government debt. So that's almost 30% of American government debt that's held by foreign governments are held by China. And for America to continue to finance the government deficit to the tune of $22 trillion, and I've seen forecasts over the next few years, there's going to be another additional $2 trillion to finance tax cuts and things like that. Where is America going to sell its debt if Chinese are turning away from America, right? So that's at the financial level. And then finally, at the intellectual level, there's everywhere I go to the universities, even to the Silicon Valley companies, there's lots of people from China, originally from China, that are contributing greatly to American life and American business activity. If all of that's going to be curtailed over time, I think both countries will hurt a lot. So I really don't understand what happened over the last 18 months. It's like we're on Valentine's Day, yet we're in the middle of the worst storm that's ever happened in San Diego. So I don't get this.
Yeah, well, I guess the political climate has changed too.
The political climate certainly has changed.
Yeah. So, it's undeniable that the U.S. and China are in a more competitive relationship now. People view it as a contest.
Yeah.
Economist covers, this is just standard framework for thinking about U.S.-China relations now. But what are we actually competing about?
Well, I think from the American perspective, there are several areas. The first thing is, I think, America's own introspection about the hollowing out of the manufacturing base, and also seeing China becoming more proficient at developing technology, becoming leaders in certain areas of technology. That presents a fear. So there's this sense of anxiety about, sometime in the future, China's going to become an upgraded country in terms of high-tech manufacturing that will become more competitive than we are. That's one level of anxiety. The other level of anxiety is, if China develops all this great technology, how about the military? They're going to use that to the military advantage. So that's the second thing. The third thing is just overall sort of global influence. America still today is a preeminent global power, and when you look at all of these global institutions, the World Bank. I think the World Bank chief just stepped down, and it's kind of interesting to see that the appointment is to be made by the American president.
It's traditional. The American heads the World Bank, a European heads the IMF, Japanese the ADB.
So you still have kind of the American dominance in global institutions. So when they see things like the One Belt One Road initiative, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, that's kind of initiated by China, there is a little sense of anxiety there. So at those levels, from technology manufacturing to military to global institutions, these are sort of largely the three levels where that's giving America an anxiety. From the Chinese perspective,
that's what I want to ask.
That's not how China is seeing it. I think really, if you look at the Communist Party today, they really have two broad objectives, sort of two goals. One is to continue to grow Chinese economy so that Chinese citizens are wealthier and earning better income every year. Okay, so so the life is better every year, and that's giving legitimacy to the party, to a single party system. The second thing is this is a relatively new concept of 民族复兴, which is unfortunately mistranslated into English as national rejuvenation. It is nothing to do with nationalism, but it really is talking about the renaissance of the Chinese culture and the Chinese people. That's the way I see 民族复兴 means. And the Xi Jinping government is talking about that as a communications point, but I think it's been misinterpreted in the West. And the reason it's been misinterpreted is if you look at Chinese history, the recent several hundred years of Chinese history, especially the late Qing dynasty, has been one of humiliation and shame, starting from the Boxer Rebellion, the Eight Nations Alliance, the 八国联军, to the Opium War, to the Japanese invasion of China. China has been basically raped in a very bad way. And so when the Xi Jinping government comes in, he is saying, look, we need to eliminate this sense of shame that China has suffered at the hands of foreign powers. In the future, we need to make sure that Chinese people, when they travel abroad, they feel proud of themselves and not feel like they can be 好欺负, can be beat up upon. I still remember when I was young, I saw a Bruce Lee movie. And the Bruce Lee movie, there's this one scene that is vivid, it's still in my memory. The movie, the scene was that a bunch of Japanese people went to Bruce Lee's training center, his martial arts training center, and gave him a, what do you call it, 蝙蝠? It's a banner, right? On the banner it says, 东亚病夫. It says, the sick man of the East. That is what the Japanese call the Chinese. So all that sense of humiliation and shame, I think is the impetus behind this whole idea of 民族复兴, the renaissance of the Chinese. So I think the communist government, besides the economic aspect, is taking on to itself this sort of sense of obligation to make sure that China in the future will be strong. Strong not in an aggressive way, but strong in the sense that so in the future Chinese people will not be looked down upon by foreigners. I think that's really what's happening. But the communication somehow did not translate well into the United States. I see your face,
I think,
your downing face.
I mean,
so,
yeah. Yeah, because
but I want to put it out there.
Yeah.
You can believe it. You can study it yourself. But I think it's anyone that's interested in understanding the Chinese psyche today needs to understand Chinese recent history, the last 200 years of Chinese history.
Well, certainly, I think that the century of humiliation framework is one that's alarming to the outside world because it sounds like it's time to pay back the foreigners. It's like, no, it's an anti-foreign kind of framing. It's not just pride that China's standing up, but it's also attributing the fact that China was humiliated because of the West. And that framework is not a framework that promotes cooperation.
Well, that's your hypothesis. I disagree. I think I think the communication of this sort of renaissance of the Chinese is not quite well communicated. And that's why it comes across as being threatening. But I think if you look at the history of China and the Chinese people as a people, we're not very aggressive people. China has largely been very defensive in all of its sort of psyche. I want to sort of paraphrase Henry Kissinger. I think he once said that China is always surrounded by strong neighbors. And America has never been, has always had weak neighbors around its borders. So sitting in America, it's hard to understand how the China fields, with Russia to the north, India to the south, Japan and Korea being close to Americans. So I think we need to reflect on that, on the circumstances.
Okay, so now of course you didn't grow up in China. You grew up in Taiwan. You're educated in America. Then you went back to China.
Yeah.
So to lead a major company. So how does that perspective, growing up in Taiwan, being educated in America, how does that, you didn't study the textbooks about Century of Humiliation.
Absolutely, I did.
In Taiwan.
Yes. I'm very fortunate in two respects. Number one, I was brought up Chinese. I went to Chinese school. I didn't speak English until I was in boarding school in the United States. And absolutely, those things are in the history books.
In Taiwan.
And the other aspect is, fortunately, I came here when I was relatively young. I spent most of my formative years in the United States, so I think I understand Americans.
Right.
I involve myself a lot in sports, which is a very big part in America. And so I feel quite fortunate that I could have sort of both perspectives and can be sort of balanced about it.
Great. So now the view in China's official media now is that, well, I mean, you've said something similar, that basically Americans are freaking out because China is so successful. And as China gets closer to the United States in GDP and in technological sophistication and in military strength and everything, that is basically the narrowing of the gap between the two countries. That's the big problem, which is what is normally called the Thucydides trap, right? That just a rising power and the dominant power is very hard for them to get along, especially because the dominant power feels very threatened and overreacts to the threat of the rising power.
Yes.
So is it your view that basically that's what's going on?
I think we have all the ingredients
Yeah.
of a Thucydides trap. Whether it's going to end up in war really depend on us.
Right.
Depend on all of us to figure things out. Now, China is very, very different from the Cold War, from the Russia era. Or China is very different from Russia.
Well, the relationship between the two countries is very different.
I would say that the relationship between the United States and Russia doesn't have to be symbiotic, and in a way it's sort of zero-sum.
Right.
The Russian economy is much smaller.
Oh, yeah.
Russia has a population of 130 million people, and they lose about 600,000 people every day. Every year. Every year. Not every day. And from an economic standpoint, it's a declining power. But it's being propped up because they have a regime that wants to flex its muscles. But if Russia does very poorly, which America can do by depressing oil prices, that doesn't hurt Americans. Okay,
Right.
but if China does very poorly, I think it's foolish for anybody to think that, the Chinese stock market is the worst performing stock market this year. Chinese economy is going to the craps, and therefore that'll give America an advantage in the trade negotiation. That is a foolish thing.
Of course.
It's already coming back to bite
Right.
the United States. So this relationship, if people start to realize that we have to live together in a constructive way, then people will find ways to reach out, to find areas of cooperation. Of course, there's going to be areas of disagreement. I think there's a huge disagreement on political systems and how a country should be governed.
Yeah.
We can cover that, but I think there are big differences in the stage of development. Even though China is catching up to the United States in GDP, but if you look at GDP per capita, China is still a developing country. Now, sure enough, there's about 300 million consumers, middle-class citizens in China that are probably just as well off as people who are living in LA or,
not better.
If not better. But
Better airports for sure.
better airports, yes. I mean, are you so surprised that we can't even build a high-speed rail between San Francisco and LA? And in China, that's just not an issue. And those are the benefits of a single-party system. When the government decides that they want to execute, they want to do something, it gets done to the benefit of the people. So what I'm getting at is China is still, there's still 3/4 of the population that are still have a very, very low level of income. China's GDP per capita today is about roughly around $9,000 US. America is at $56,000 US. So China still has a long way to go before it can feel like a rich country.
So the backlash against China is occurring not just in the United States, but it's in other advanced industrial countries as well.
Yeah.
We see it in Europe. We see it in Japan. Of course, Japan-China relations are always a special case. But and so I'm wondering if, many of us here have a lot of problems with the way our own government is going about foreign policy now. But I'm wondering if you believe that there are policies that China's leaders have undertaken that are in part causing this backlash.
So before I get to that question, I want to address whether the backlash is global, i.e. the Europeans and Japanese are also feeling the same way. I think the Europeans and the Japanese feel quite ambivalent. I think there's one level, at the national security level, obviously you have this investigation of Huawei, whether Huawei equipment is safe from a national security standpoint, and America has gotten the European governments involved in that. But at the trade level, everyone is thinking, gee, China has this giant economy. It's going to be driven by domestic demand. They're going to import a lot of things. Xi Jinping has said, in the next 15 years, China is going to import $30 trillion US of goods and $10 trillion of services. All of that is opportunity to sell to China. So if US leaves a vacuum, we ought to jump in. So if I was Germany or France or Italy, I'm thinking that's exactly what I should be doing. So I think the Europeans and the Japanese feel very ambivalent. There are a lot of Japanese companies operating in China, and their products are very popular in China. They'd love to sell to the Chinese population. That's the big difference between China and Russia. Russia doesn't have a viable middle class that is really soft power. If you are consuming a lot from all over the world, people have to listen to you. Right. So that's that. I think your question is about whether the Chinese, is there anything that the Chinese have done, the Chinese government has done that's
provoked the
backlash? I think not by design.
Of course not.
I think if you look at some of the areas that Americans are worried about, for example, on intellectual property, in fact, China has improved in its protection of intellectual property. I want to separate that from cybersecurity. Okay, that's the stuff of the CIA. That's a separate matter. But just the so-called stealing of intellectual property, I think if you look at the last 5 years, China has improved. There's a study by the Peterson Institute that said, is the stuff of copyright infringement, IP infringement, is that going on? Absolutely, it's going on, but it's been exaggerated. That's basically the point of the Peterson Institute. What it said is that they look at the royalty payments that China has made to globally to the other countries. In 2017, it was $29 billion. It's the second largest after the United States. Well, there's two countries that are in between. It's Netherlands and Ireland, but those are special entity.
Right.
You know, you take those out. China pays the second largest royalty payments for intellectual property to the rest of the world. Okay, so I think if you look at the IP issue, that's being, China has actually improved. Is there a sense that Chinese government's saying, hey, look, if you guys want to come in and access to 1.3 billion people, all of the consumers, you need to transfer some technology. We need to protect some weaker industries. Yes, absolutely. And I think these are some of the issues that this trade negotiations will try to address.
Yeah, because there's still a lot of sectors that are not open.
Absolutely.
To
so that's not been that's been going on for a long time. So there's really nothing that the Chinese have done recently that's provoked this. I think what's been I would probably say there's a couple of things that has gotten people scared, but not by design. I think they've all been misunderstood. I think one thing is this China Manufacturing 2025. It's really part of the national rejuvenation, if you will. And there's really nothing wrong with the Chinese government saying, hey, look, we've been making clothing and shoes and low-end manufacturing. We're assembling phones for Tim Cook. Why can't we invent iPhones in our own country? Why can't we upgrade our own technology in manufacturing? So that's really what's behind the 2025 plan. But when it's translated over here, it becomes very, very threatening.
Well,
right?
I think it was the setting of the targets for China to dominate certain sectors, not just inside China, but internationally, with fixed, percentages and things like that set up a kind of zero-sum framework.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of X amount of software will have to be procured domestically.
Right. Plus, it's led by the government as massive amounts of money. And it's not, it's private firms as well as state-owned, but it's a lot of money going into
I would say yes. I agree, and I think that's gotten people worried. But I think there is a little bit of a national security element behind that. Since the revelation by Edward Snowden about all these backdoor traps that they can build into routers and Cisco equipment, the Chinese government is concerned. The same reason why the American government is concerned about 5G equipment made by Huawei. So I think that's what's happening. Okay. The other area is I think the Chinese government has been promoting this idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics, except that here in America we only hear about socialism, and we say, oh, that's Marxist. They are on a different system. They have different values. But I think the emphasis ought to be on with Chinese characteristics, which is very market-driven, very entrepreneurial. You look at the Chinese small businesses and Chinese entrepreneurs, their values toward a free market economy is very, very similar to Americans. Anyway, so the question whether China has done something recently in terms of policy or anything that's gotten America scared, I would say yes, in a way, they emphasize certain things, but it's been misinterpreted here in America.
Okay. So do you feel that there's a bias why are American businesses so frustrated with the situation in China today? Because business used to be the key constituency for engagement policy with China. And it's their disaffection that really is a major factor in changing the political mood.
Sure.
Without the support of business. And right now, the national security concerns are dominating. Normally, you have national security concerns. Then the business people always want to do business. And the White House has to strike the balance.
Yeah.
But right now, national security is dominating, and business isn't really pushing back very much. So that's, I think, because they're frustrated with the situation in China.
Okay.
So do you think the Chinese government could fix that?
I think there's definitely room for improvement. For example, in the pharmaceutical industry, this market can be a little bit more open to American and European drug companies to come in. I think that in the area of technology, both hardware and software is always going to be tricky because of the national security concerns on both sides.
National security in all technologies or just in internet and information communication?
Communications hardware, communications devices, cell phones. You know, America is now banning Huawei cell phones from being sold here. But Apple is still
It's really too bad because they're really good.
Apple is still selling very well in China, but I don't want to see a day when Chinese government says you're not allowed to sell iPhones in China anymore. That would be a bad result. But that could happen if there's too much. If America or the current administration puts on too much pressure. But I think you're right. There's definitely room for improvement. One of the biggest things we've talked about this is what's giving sort of the current administration fuel to be very, very aggressive toward China is that the business community are not putting up a fight. Right. They're saying, go put some pressure on China so that we can open up markets in China. I think there's a little bit of jumping on the bandwagon, but I think given what happened to Apple, you know, with they were blaming their latest quarter on Chinese weakness, American companies are suffering. So that I think you're going to start. My prediction is in the next 6 to 9 months, there will be people that will come out, business people that will come out and strike a more conciliatory tone toward that. We work with Starbucks in China. They are doing extremely well in China. They're adding something like over 200 stores every year in China. I mean, you know, there's some American companies that are still very successful.
Right.
So they decide to keep quiet, or they decide to run for president.
Yeah, right. Right. That's good. Exactly. Yeah. So what's his position on U.S.-China relations? U.S.-China.
I don't know. I can't speak for Howard Schultz, but I have to say, it's refreshing and it's surprising to see how antagonistic the very far left Democrats or the Democratic Party has gone so far to the left that they are attacking Howard Schultz, who is a centrist Democrat, but except that he realized that he couldn't run as a Democrat. He has to run as an independent. It's kind of
well, he'll take votes from Democrats, which is why they don't want him to run.
He'll take votes from the Republicans too. I mean, he'll be a great alternative to Trump from a Republican standpoint.
So have you signed on with Harold Schultz? No.
I can't vote here, but I would say from an objective foreigner standpoint, he would seem like a very attractive candidate to me.
I think a lot of people feel we elected a businessman this time. We're not so sure we want another businessman.
There is a difference. I feel like I'm defending Howard Schultz, but I have to say, he grew up in the projects in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
He is a self-made, successful businessman, and.
Yes.
So.
Okay, so let's talk about what's happening right now with the so-called trade war, which I hate to talk about trade war. It's but in Chinese, that's what people call it too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So as a business, how is this going to affect Alibaba? Is it impacting your business?
The business itself is not suffering because the Alibaba business is driven by domestic consumption,
Right.
and also to an extent of our cloud computing business, the corporate digital transformation of China. And so none of that has anything to do with exports
Right.
or tariffs or anything. But from a sentiment standpoint, because we have a stock that's listed on the New York Stock Exchange, the investors treat the Alibaba stock as a proxy for China's health. So when they don't feel good about China, they will try to short our stock. That's really the only effect.
Okay.
Yeah.
But what about going global? Is if we really move toward two blocks in the information and communication technology domain, will this limit Alibaba's potential to really go global?
I think so. Certainly, it'll limit our potential to operate in the United States and maybe in certain European countries. So it's a bad thing to have to create these two parallel universes that don't work with each other. Where we are expanding internationally is in Southeast Asia. The Southeast Asian countries, their economies are developing economies. Their history in terms of economics looks more like how China has developed over the last 20 years. So when we come in, they welcome us to come in. And even some of the, I would say, poorer European countries, countries like, Spain, where the unemployment rate is 25%, they actually love to buy from our platform, from products from China.
Sure.
So, but if we are creating two separate universes and they are antagonistic to each other, that's definitely going to affect our ability to, expand overseas. It's going to affect American companies from doing business in the other sphere, if you will.
So this horrible decoupling that appears to have already begun, which, I guess from Americans' perspective, this really sort of started with the secure and controllable policy of the Chinese government, which limited our companies from operating in China. And now the United States is doing the same, and even more so, perhaps.
Yeah.
So, but it's primarily in this information communication technology. So I guess something I've been wondering is, can we limit this? Maybe we're just going to have to live with this. There's no going back to full integration in that area. But can we limit it to just the information and communication technologies and still have this very fruitful symbiotic relationship in developing biotech and what about robotics? What about AI? AI people are treating as a kind of symbol. They're linking it to national security, and of course, it has potential to affect your military capabilities. But do you think we can still manage to stay integrated in these other technological domains? Or is it going to snowball?
I think there's definitely an opportunity to work together. Again, going back to the idea of symbiosis.
Right.
Just look at AI. Well, I don't know if you read Kai-Fu Lee's book about the AI superpowers, and China is maybe getting better at AI because the availability of data and all the scientists that could create algorithms and also, cloud computing capability and all that. I think in a way it is, he's trying to, look, Kai-Fu is a great friend of mine, but he's over-dramatizing this competitive nature of AI between the two countries. I think the reality is, if you look at the applications of AI, AI can now detect diseases and get better treatment to people. AI can be applied to agriculture to produce better crop yields. AI can be applied to manufacturing to reduce the defective rates. If you look at the application of AI in all of these sectors, why shouldn't certain technology developed in one country, why shouldn't that be shared for the benefit of humankind?
Okay.
And I think there's a lot of room for cooperation. So just to take AI as an example, people should be thinking about that. Instead, when people think of AI, they think about fighting robots. Right. So I just think that that's a misunderstanding of AI.
Right, but it's going to be a big challenge to preserve that kind of integration because the decoupling in the internet space also generates this kind of mutual hostility. Mm-hmm. And
there are solvable problems. I'll give you an example of AI. We are developing we're working with a farmers cooperative in China on developing a way to assess credit to the farmers. They have their data sets. We have our data sets. And then we say it's better for the two data sets to work together to train the machines. But our client says, whoa, we're concerned about giving our data to you, so let's figure out a way to train the machine with two separate data sets. And we developed a technology to compartmentalize their data so it's all encrypted and protected. And we don't have access, we don't see that data, but we can continue to use two data sets to train the machine so that the machine gets smarter. So there are ways to solve these sort of concerns about data and privacy issues. I just think that if people try hard enough and think hard enough, we can find good solutions.
Okay, let's hope that we can do that.
Yeah.
So Alibaba is a Chinese company, but its creation included bringing together a lot of know-how that's international, including that you brought, for one thing, and others in the company. So technology, finance, corporate governance, all united by Jack Ma's unique vision. So do you think a company like Alibaba could be created today?
It's harder today. I don't think it's impossible, but it's harder today for the same reason that it's harder to create another Google or Amazon or Facebook today than 15, 20 years ago when internet was a new thing. And I think we were lucky to catch the explosion of internet usage. I think 10 years from now, Alibaba may not be the top internet company in China. There could be 2 or 3 other companies that'll come up. So we're certainly being very paranoid. We are definitely subscribed to Andy Grove's thesis of only the paranoid survive.
So let's talk now about what non-governmental organizations like businesses or universities or NGOs can do to try to reduce this growing hostility in U.S.-China relations.
Yeah.
So do you have any good ideas? I
don't have the perfect ideas, but having forums like this for people to exchange views, I think that's good. I think China suffers from one area, and that is today for the Chinese to go internationally to communicate to the rest of the world, they're speaking in their second language. And that's a huge problem. I happen to, I grew up only speaking Chinese, and I know how difficult it is going to a new environment, not speaking the language, not being able to communicate. So today, if there are international forums and events, let's say Davos and things like that, you don't see a lot of Chinese either government officials or business people that can be as articulate as Jack Ma. So that's a problem because the story is not being told properly. So I think, I think when I go back, I'm going to have to start to think about how do we make sure that enough people from China who have the experience, the business experience and the knowledge, and the language capability, and push them out to talk about what is really happening in China, rather than people getting their information from the New York Times only. The New York Times is important. It reports on certain aspect of China, but I think there's 90% of China that people don't know about, don't understand.
Yeah, which is why we at 21st Century China Center are starting this new project on China from the ground up.
Right.
Because I agree with you that people look at China as a monolith.
Right.
And they are always questioning, what does China want? What are its goals? Well, Chinese people want a whole diversity of different things.
Absolutely.
And so that's why we're going to be studying more through surveys and other types of data what ordinary people in China want.
And the other thing is, in the other direction, I think today there is a risk that Chinese people become very insular, that they don't understand enough about what's happening in America and Europe or other parts of Asia. And what's not helping is if American universities are shutting off Chinese academics and students from coming here to really get a perspective and then bring that back to China. If that's not happening anymore, that's a very bad thing.
Yeah, I'll say. It's, universities are really one of the places where Chinese and Americans have come together the most fruitfully.
Yeah.
It's really been a great thing, and it would be horrible to see that end. But I can tell you that it's at risk for sure because of the concerns about loss of technology and Chinese students coming here, and this concern about counter-espionage. The fact that, there is some effort on the part of the Chinese government. Certainly most Chinese students, I assume, are here for legitimate purposes. And even those who report back to the Chinese government are here for legitimate purposes, but they feel under pressure to report back. So it's a huge problem. I mean, the FBI, DHS, all of these agencies, and I was just in Washington this week, and and these people are professionals.
Yeah.
They're not political people, really, but they are they've been worried about this, I think, for a long time, and now they have a political leadership that is listening to them and really moving forward on this. And they're going out to universities to warn them that they have to be very careful about how they handle Chinese students in certain technical specialties. And it's pretty broad.
What about Chinese Americans? People like my wife who's born here.
Yeah.
Is she a threat?
Well, I'm very worried about this.
I think there's a slippery slope here.
Yeah.
And I think if America is confident of its values and what they could teach young people, there shouldn't be fear. I think in certain areas of research, if it touches on national security issues, there's a whole sort of classified system, right? Do you have a classified status to work in a certain lab and things like that? So I think that apparatus is in place.
We don't have classified research at universities typically, but we do. But even among technologies, some are more directly related to national security than others. I think the danger is when you have too expansive a definition of which technologies are related to national security. So now on the Chinese side, we're facing restrictions too, though. You know, because restrictions on Westerners doing research, on they're creating a lot of new textbooks. They don't want Western articles, not so much in science and engineering, but more in social science and humanities. So what's driving that, do you think? It's not national security.
I think it's a different motivation. I think a lot of academics, the Chinese are worried about their expression of very liberal opinions, which in a single party state, that sometimes that could be viewed as being disruptive. It is what it is. The fact is, China today is a single party system, so there's going to be restrictions on academic freedoms and freedom of expression. Do people like that? I think most people don't like it
for sure.
But I think that's how the Communist Party needs to control that in order to feel confident about pushing all their policies in other areas. But it is what it is, and I think the single party system is in place because the elite in China feel that China is still a developing country. It is not where it should be, and to get, I talked about the two broader goals: to make sure that the population is every year wealthier and doing better. And also to have this sort of restore this sense of renaissance and pride about the Chinese culture. They feel that dissent has to take a back seat, and whatever they're doing is right, and that's what it is, and it has to be clearly communicated.
So do you think people will still continue to make that trade-off if the economic growth slows and things get a little tougher economically in China?
I think if people's income levels are declining every year.
No, but not declining. Maybe just not growing.
See, here's the thing: the slowdown, right? So the so-called Chinese slowdown. People are obsessing over whether Chinese economy grows 6.6% or 6.4%.
It's ridiculous.
And it's ridiculous because 6% of $13 trillion economy. That's creating $800 billion of new wealth every year.
Right.
That's an entire economy of the Netherlands. So every year, China is creating a new Netherlands every year. That's what's going on. And today, I think what's ultimately going to happen, maybe 20, 30 years from now, if you have 300 million people in the middle class, that grows to 600 million people, to 700 million people, and all of their material needs are satisfied, and they're just as well off as anybody living in San Diego or New York or San Francisco, maybe they would start to demand a little bit of freedom in other areas, and we'll see what happens.
Well, of course, things have improved tremendously from when I started studying China. Back in the Mao era. It's just that the improvement, the pace of improvement has kind of slowed down, and so it's a big question mark about how people in China feel about that.
I think I can understand that sentiment, I think especially over the last, say, 3 or 4 years. But it is what it is.
Yeah, right.
But I think with China is the longer term trajectory is still growth, and I believe over time more liberalization in all sectors of the economy. So we have to live with sort of 3 steps forward, 2 steps back kind of situation, right?
Well, you saw Taiwan go from being a one-party state to being
to a disaster
Oh, is
economically.
that's the
Well,
way you see
I
it
think
now?
look, we're going to have family issues now. Look at what's happening to Taiwan economically. People are very, very unhappy because I think the current government is focused on the wrong things and intentionally trying to shut off its all the relationships with China. And Taiwan could benefit so much from China.
But
the
it
trade.
is quite integrated with China.
It is
The economy
very,
is.
very integrated in China. I think there's something like 2 million Taiwanese people working in China out of a population of 23 million people.
Yeah.
So, very integrated, but the policy of the government right now is to anything that's having anything to do with China is being turned back.
Okay, so let's, I think we're having such a good time, but there are questions out there in the audience, so let me ask my last question. The NBA All-Star Game is just around the corner.
Yeah.
Do you have any favorite player from the Eastern Conference All-Stars?
Absolutely. I have 4 favorite players.
Okay.
D'Angelo Russell,
All right.
Rodi Kurucs, Joe Harris, and Jared Allen. They all play for the Brooklyn Nets.
So you're going to go watch the games?
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
So what about the sports future for San Diego? What do you have in mind for us?
I know there are a lot of sports fans in San Diego, and I think the future is quite interesting. I've been personally involved in bringing in the indoor lacrosse team. It's called the San Diego Seals. It's great. And I just found out about this. There's a new football league, professional football league, called the Alliance of American Football, AAF. Nobody's heard about it, but they just played their inaugural game this past weekend with great TV ratings. I don't think the San Diego team played. I'm not sure which team played, but
Do we have a
San Diego has a team. It's called the San Diego Fleet. They lost. Okay, but they have a professional football team now. I don't know where they play though. I'm not sure which stadium.
Well, the game was in Arizona, the first game.
I see. So they are still looking for a home site.
There's a game coming up here, but
Yeah. So this issue with San Diego is there's a lack of a proper venue for professional sports teams to play. Obviously, the Chargers left because they felt the stadium was not up to scratch, and they needed to build a new stadium. They needed some city government financing and couldn't get it. So that's kind of the issue. So you need to have, I guess, governments that are going to be a little bit more friendly to sports teams, and also business people that have a little bit more daring to make that upfront investment. Building a stadium is $1 billion type of proposition, so it's not an easy thing.
Right. All right, well, thanks so much. Let's open it to the audience.
First, let's give these guys a fantastic. I got to say to you two both, that was riveting. And I've heard a lot of things build as conversations that weren't really dialogue, and that was really a dialogue. So thank you both. That was fantastic. We do have a couple of questions from the floor we're going to throw at you. I think a lot of these are for Joe. So please
I
don't
hope
feel,
so.
Don't
Yes.
feel too left out.
You can always talk to me, but you can't.
All right, so the first one, very interesting, about conditions in China. Is economic reform in China moving in the right direction? Are we going forward or backward right now?
Market reforms.
I think there's a feeling among business people in China that things have stalled a little bit, or even moved toward more state control of businesses. But I would say that this is more of a pendulum. And I think in recent months, the senior leadership in the government have become better listeners. They're listening to the business people. And the most recent measure is tax relief for small businesses. All of last year, they were trying to put more restrictions on small businesses in terms of tax enforcement and things like that. Now they've realized that they've gone a little bit too far. So this tax relief for small business is quite welcome. So I think that the short answer is yes, reform has stalled a little bit. I think it's disappointed some people, especially in the business sector, and it's hit the confidence of the business people. And that's actually contributing to some of the slowdown, because when business people don't have the confidence, investment stops. And we all know that investment is part of the economy, a part of the economic growth. So, but I think the government right now is starting to self-correct with some of the measures. I think it's important that they promote this fiscal policy. In the past, the government has used monetary policy, in other words, pumping a lot of liquidity into the system and hoping that that money will be channeled to productive enterprises. But the problem is that you have these large state-owned banks that have no incentive to really channel the funds to where it should go. And instead, the money went into property market, speculation in the stock market, and all that. So monetary policy doesn't work anymore. Now is the time for the Chinese government to run more of a deficit, fiscal policy, and cutting taxes is one of them. So I think it's quite welcome. But that's just been a measure that's only announced in January, so we'll have to see what happens.
So I was going to say, you're a very big company, obviously, but you have contact with an enormous number of small businesses selling through Taobao and other things.
Yeah.
Would you say they're starting to feel some relief, starting to signal, or is it still too early for them?
It's too early right now. We don't see the tangible effects yet, but I think it'll work through. Yeah. Yeah.
Great, thank you. This is kind of related. Is a government connection crucial for the success of private enterprise? I assume they mean in China. The question could be asked about the United States too, but I assume it's a question.
Oh yeah. So I think connection is the wrong word. I think good relationship and also building the trust between enterprise and government is a universal idea. For if you're a company in any country, you want to have good relationship with the government. If you look at Google, Amazon, Facebook, they have tons of lobbyists in Washington. What are they doing? They're building that relationship and trust with the government. So same with a company like Alibaba. We need to make sure that whatever we do, because what we do is all very new. So when government regulators see new things, new phenomena, the first reaction is not, oh great, let's go for it. The first reaction is, is this right? How do we regulate it? So you need to make sure that you're transparent to the government, let them know about what's going on, and so that you build this sort of level of trust without engendering any knee-jerk reaction from the regulators. So I think it's important, yes.
Alibaba is doing very interesting things in Hangzhou in terms of developing a smart city approach, very much in conjunction with government, but in a way, I think a lot of people would say, well, you're out ahead, kind of leading the way. Is that something you would point to as an example of good relation with the government?
It's both good relationship and also it's good business because the government sector, the municipalities, there are over, I think, 160 cities in China, 160 cities in China that have a population of more than 1 million people. In America, it's about 10, right? Yeah. So all these cities all have issues with traffic management, police enforcement, and things like that. So they need to have tons of technology. And if we can provide the right technology to them and sell the technology to them, that'll be welcome. So that's actually good for our business.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got so many great questions here. I'm going to have to perform some triage. We've only got really about 3 or 5 minutes left. But let me ask you a question about Alibaba. I hope that's okay. It's a very interesting question here. The questioner says, in one of Jack Ma's public speeches, he mentions Alibaba is not an e-commerce company, but a data company. What's your opinion about about Alibaba's position in the big data revolution in China, or however you want to tackle that question?
That's a question that's related to AI.
Yeah.
Because to be good at AI, you need to have large amounts of data to train the machines. I think I want to demystify AI a little bit for the audience here. AI is about teaching machines to be almost as smart as human beings. We all debate whether it can be more smarter than human beings, but to feed the machine the food of a machine in the AI context is data. The more data it absorbs, it can learn better. So for example, image recognition. To recognize whether an animal is a cat or a dog, you feed the machine literally millions of photos of cats and dogs and say, okay, that's a cat, yes. No, that's a dog. No. So that's how you teach.
Yeah.
Machines are actually pretty dumb. They're not like babies who, when they see a cat maybe once or twice, they could recognize a cat. But machines, you need to have millions and millions of photos. That's all data. So we are, if you look at the large-scale internet companies in the world, the Facebooks of the world, Amazon, they are literally serving billions of people every day in their regular service. So they have regular touches with consumers, with users. And in that process, they're always collecting large amounts of data. And then they would use that data to improve their own service and also move into adjacent areas to launch new products and services.
Being paranoid in particular, it's important to move into those adjacent spaces before anybody else moves into them.
Yeah, that's that.
Very good. So a number of people have put forward versions of this question. It's a very sensitive one, which is how worried are you about a backlash against Chinese Americans, Chinese students in the United States? When we think of the tremendous contribution that Chinese, whether they're born here or naturalized or just visiting, how worried are you about the rough edges of this backlash?
I do worry about it because history repeats itself. I think people don't know this, that up until about 6 months ago, there used to be a Supreme Court case that's infamous. It's Korematsu. I don't know if you know about it. The Korematsu case is about, basically the Supreme Court says it's actually not unconstitutional. It's okay to lock up Japanese Americans in these internment camps. It's a very infamous case. Korematsu was still good law until I think about 6 months ago when the Supreme Court actually in dictum reversed. I think the legal status is still not very clear. But today, if the similar things happen, let's say to Chinese Americans, it is, I'm not sure, and people say, oh, that's unconstitutional, the Supreme Court will have a case. And I'm not sure how it's going to be decided. Yes, history repeats itself, so I'm worried.
Well, I think it's okay to stop on that note, even though it's a very sobering note. I think it gives us a responsibility, and that you have given us a charge, in a sense, that we need to be vigilant and work against this. So.
Well, and, our task force, I'd just like to make a plug for people to go on our website and read our task force report that you were part of the task force, Barry, and we did this together, 21st Century China Center with the Asia Society, course correction toward a effective and sustainable policy toward China. And, we talk about preventing those kinds of overreactions, and we warn against them, and it's the loss of talent and the possibility of anti-Chinese, Red Scare, this kind of thing. So, certainly our voices are being expressed, that concern, and trying to slow down this kind of rush to talk about restrictions on students and export controls and things like this. So,
No, I think I'd really appreciate this opportunity to have this exchange, because I think most Americans are quite constructive. It's just that right now the extreme voice is taking over the narrative, and not enough people have spoken up. But I think you will see more and more of that sort of more moderate and more constructive voice that says, look, we've got plenty of problems with China. They've got all these areas where they need to improve, and we're going to be very clear about that. But the way moving forward is a symbiotic relationship. We need to find ways, areas where the two countries can cooperate and work with each other, because the potential damage, the loss, both economics and human-wise, is just too large.
Right.
If we don't work together.
All right.
So thank you very much.